McNeese shoots 40% from three and has the sixth highest turnover rate in the country, but I'm not worried about them upsetting Gonzaga, and I'll tell you why.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Wednesday. Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. We are covering the entire Midwest region today as we are one day away from the full slate of games, including Gonzaga's game against McNeese State on Thursday. So we're talking the entire Midwest region to close out the show. We're also talking specifically about the potential second round matchup for Gonzaga, assuming they get past McNeese. That would be a matchup between the winner of Kansas and Samford. Some big stories coming out of Lawrence, Kansas. Kevin McCullar out for the NCAA Tournament. What does that mean for Bill Self's team? We'll get to that. But we are going to start the show talking about McNeese. Thursday's episode will get a little bit more into the keys to the game, what Gonzaga specifically needs to do to avoid falling victim to a 12-5 upset, make sure that they are in the second round of the NCAA tournament and potentially getting a chance to continue that Sweet 16 streak. We're going to get to that more on Thursday's episode. Today, though, we're just going to meet this McNeese team. And I do want to acknowledge, I'm not going to go fully into it, but Graham Ike was given an honorable mention All-American nod. Huge accomplishment for Graham coming off of an entire missed season with that knee injury at Wyoming, or the foot injury, at Wyoming, to now be an All-American honorable mention as the star player for Gonzaga. Just a huge, great story to him. Big golf claps for him for getting to that point. All right, let's get into this team. McNeese State, the Cowboys, 5 versus 12, always a trendy upset pick. We are seeing a lot of narrative. The national media, lots of people out there really hammering this McNeese team as the pick. And look, if you get a 5 seed, this is just part of the deal. I guarantee Wisconsin fans are talking about it. I suspect Wisconsin, their game against James Madison, probably the most picked 12-5 upset game out there just because of how big of a story James Madison has been with their upset win over Michigan State. Wisconsin struggling down the stretch. They're hearing it. Grand Canyon and St. Mary's, they're hearing it over there. Probably a little bit less with UAB and San Diego State, although I'm sure it's getting talked about a lot. But people like to see Gonzaga lose. This McNeese State team has been one of the most fun stories in college basketball this year. I can understand why there is this media or this narrative being pushed by the media that McNeese State is going to pull the upset, going to beat Gonzaga, going to advance to play the winner of Kansas and Samford. But I look, and the more I do the digging, and obviously I've watched all of this, every game of this Gonzaga season. I'm a fan of the Zags. I'm not going to pretend that there is a complete non-bias here. But the more you dig into the numbers, the more you look at this McNeese State team, the matchup against Gonzaga, it feels pretty good for the Zags. That's by no means an indication that it's not going to happen. I don't think anybody would have looked at St. Peter's in Kentucky and thought, well, St. Peter's clearly has an advantage here. That's not how it works. Upsets happen because teams that are not as good beat teams that are better. Definitely could happen here. But there's a lot to like in Gonzaga's favor. We'll talk about the Cowboys here. They're 30-3 on the season. They went 17-1 in the Southland Conference. That's our first kind of knock here. The Southland Conference, according to KenPom ranks all of the data for the 33 conferences, ranks them by just their how well they did in the non-conference, how well they did overall to give a ranking of the 33 conferences. The Southland was 28th out of 33, one of the legitimate worst college basketball conferences in the country. For people who say, oh, the Gonzaga plays in a high school gym, blah, blah, blah. WCC was, I believe, 7th or 8th. I actually didn't pull it all the way up. No, they're not 7th because that would be the Power 6. Mountain West was 7th. They're probably 9th or 10th would be my guess with the A10 and the AAC in that conversation as well. The worst they probably are is 11th. 28th for the Southland Conference. You want to talk about teams that actually play borderline high school teams? That's the conference you're talking about right there. 28th out of 33. And for the Cowboys, they also didn't play a particularly strong non-conference schedule. And I hate kind of just dunking on teams, mid-major teams in particular, that don't play strong non-conference strengths of schedules because I know that it is not their fault. And for those of you who have followed Gonzaga for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, whatever it may be, you know the deal. It is hard to get teams to play Gonzaga. It is harder to get teams to play if you're a Seattle U or a San Francisco or any mid-major team like that. It's tough to get games. Having said that, it is a relevant factor for McNeese and for any team to look at who they have and who they have not played. McNeese played one team in the KenPom Top 100. That was VCU, who did not make the tournament but was the 5th seed in the A10. And look, they beat them. They're 1-0 against teams in the top 100 of KenPom's rankings. They're 1-0 in quad one games this year. They have that nice win over VCU. They only played one team that made the NCAA tournament this year. That was UAB, the Blazers, who earned the automatic bid out of the American Athletic Conference. Somewhat surprisingly, they made it to the championship. They won the AAC. It wasn't Florida Atlantic. It wasn't Memphis. It wasn't SMU. It wasn't South Florida, who won the regular season. It was UAB. But they were, I think, 6th, maybe 7th in the AAC regular season. Just a pedestrian mid-major team. Now, again, McNeese beat them. And that is a decent team and a team that is in the big dance that did get a 12 seed, the same seed as McNeese. So you can't knock them for those 2 wins. There's not anything else here. Their average KenPom ranking of the opponents they played this year, 240th. That's average. Pacific was worse than that in the WCC. Portland was around that in the WCC. Everybody else was pretty significantly ahead of that. That was their average. And that doesn't even include the fact that they played 4 non-Division I teams in the non-conference. So if you were to give them a big knock for playing non-D1 teams, that average drops below 250. That is the strength of their schedule. Now, they did get a win at Michigan. And to be honest with you, again, not trying to dunk on this team too hard, but beating Michigan at Michigan for McNeese, it probably tells you a little bit more about Michigan than anything else. Even a good mid-major team should not be able to go into Ann Arbor and beat the Wolverines. Juwan Howard got fired for many reasons, among them losing these kind of games, the worst season for Michigan in 60 years. They are rid themselves of Juwan Howard, going to move on from this, but this is a stain for them. And McNeese, again, shout out to them for getting the W here, but doesn't necessarily say what you might think it would say in most other years when talking about going into Ann Arbor and getting a W there. Now, not really, only one terrible loss for McNeese. They got a loss to Louisiana Tech, who was 95th at KenPom, lost to Western Carolina, who was 108th at KenPom. Then they got a loss to Southeast Louisiana. They are 303rd at KenPom, an ugly, ugly quad 4 loss for the Cowboys of McNeese. Again, they went 1-0 in quad 1 games, 2-2 in quad 2 with those wins over UAB and Michigan and those 2 losses we just talked about. 4-0 in quad 3, 19-1 in quad 4, with that quad 4 loss coming to Southeast Louisiana. 20 of their 33 games came in quad 4. Again, Gonzaga, not nearly at that level, not nearly that percentage of their games coming in quad 4. It's just a big difference. A lot of people like to lump, most Gonzaga fans don't, by the way, but a lot of people like to lump mid-major teams all together. And the difference between the WCC and the Southland is very, very significant. A couple other things on McNeese here. They're 60th at KenPom, 51st in adjusted offensive efficiency, 84th defensively, 282nd in tempo. They slow you down. Their 23.1% rate of turnovers, that is 6th in the country. This is the big thing. If you look at the media narrative, what people are saying, why they think Gonzaga could get upset here, they're pointing to this turnover rate for McNeese. Again, I think strength of schedule plays a big role in a lot of stats, but very notably in that turnover rate situation. They do a lot of press. I don't think the press is going to work as well against Gonzaga. I think Gonzaga is going to be able to get into their half-court offense. McNeese, not a very good defensive team if they let teams get into that half-court. Opponents are shooting 48% from 3 against McNeese. 48%. Now, Gonzaga has not been a good three-point shooting team this year. That has been a narrative repeated ad nauseum about this team. But they're playing a team that gives them up at about 50%. McNeese also allows assists on about 58% of made baskets, 332nd in the country. Effectively, if you get into your half-court offense and you're running your sets, McNeese, not a very good defensive team. Now, again, we mentioned this at the cold open. They do shoot it really well from 3, 39.5%. That's great. It's 7th in the country, 7th highest percentage from 3 in the country. That sounds like a horror story if you're a Gonzaga fan. Here's the deal. 33.5% of their points, of their field goal attempts come from 3. That's 275th in the nation. Effectively, they are a very high percentage three-point team that doesn't take a lot of them. I think that could change. I think Gonzaga's got the ability to prevent them from driving to the basket and getting to the free throw line, which is what they really do like to do. This team gets a huge percentage of their points from the free throw line, even though they're a below 70% shooting team. Very strange offensive profile. Elite three-point shooting team that doesn't take very many of them. Team that loves to get to the free throw line, even though they're not good there. Team that gets a lot of turnovers, but also gives up a bunch of threes. Very unique situation for this team, but also a situation that I don't think is particularly beneficial for McNeese. Because if their game is predicated on getting turnovers, they're playing a point guard, Ryan Nembhard, who really doesn't turn the basketball over. If they're not good when they let teams get into their half-court set. Gonzaga is elite when they get into their half-court set. They're a team that does shoot it well from three, but likes to try to drive to the basket and get to the free throw line. Yes, getting Graham Ike in foul trouble should and will be on the priority list for Will Wade and that team. But if they're not able to do it, and guess what? They don't have a single player in their rotation taller than 6'7". It's going to be pretty hard to get Graham Ike in foul trouble if you don't got guys who are anywhere near his size. If Ike can avoid foul trouble, if these guys can't get to the charity stripe, where again, they are a sub 70% free throw shooting team. So even if they get there, they got to also knock them shots down. I just see a lot of reasons why this McNeese team, and again, they're good in the things that they do, but I just don't think the matchup is particularly good for them. Ryan Nembhard, elite at taking care of the basketball. Gonzaga, elite in the half-court offense. Yeah, the three-point defense has been questionable at times this year, and I could see Will Wade and McNeese trying really hard to bump up the volume of three-point shots and beat Gonzaga by shooting threes, and that's a viable strategy and one I expect them to employ, but I just think that the matchup doesn't actually trend all that well for this Cowboys team. Now, if they do something, if they do shock the world, or I guess shock us, because the media narrative is not going to be shocked by this, it's going to be because of Shahada Wells, their starting point guard, transfer from TCU. He actually played against Gonzaga last year when Gonzaga met TCU in the round of 32. He's averaging 18 points, about 5 assists, 4.5 boards, and 3 steals per game. Really productive senior guard for that team. But again, no real height on this team, just not a roster I'm all that concerned about. However, I will acknowledge Will Wade is a fantastic coach. He was a coach at Chattanooga, coach at VCU for a couple of years, then at LSU for 5 years, led the Tigers to a 25-5 season in 2018-19, was fired after the 21-22 season after a wiretapping situation resulted in some quotes from him basically offering to pay players. Now that's not even something that is against the rules anymore. He missed a year, came back, 10-game suspension. He's back. He's a very, very good coach, and I do think that he's going to have some tricks up his sleeves, but I just don't think this matchup is really that concerning for Gonzaga. And I think a lot of people are just smashing that 5-12 because they want to hit that. They want to be able to say they predicted a 12-5 upset. But I like this matchup for Gonzaga. And it results, if Gonzaga does advance, they play the winner of a 4-13 game between Kansas and Samford. And while I suspect that more folks are going to pick McNeese to pull the upset instead of Samford, I don't agree. And I'm going to tell you exactly why I think that after a word from today's sponsor, Better Together. Are you tired of the same old daily fantasy sports grind where you make a roster, cross your fingers, and hope for the best, or losing on that last leg of your pick'em entry? Introducing Better Together, the first cooperative daily fantasy platform where teamwork triumphs talent and you can play with your friends, not against them. Pick more or less on the real-time player stats, strategize with your partner to boost your odds, and climb the leaderboard together. Better Together is the first cooperative daily fantasy application. It makes you realize that DFS is fun alone, but like a lot of other things, it's better when you're doing it together with your friends. So Better Together also gives inexperienced players an immersive way to learn about daily fantasy sports. Teaming up with and following the lead of experienced friends and teammates in a team contest can take the fear of diving in for the first time. And Gonzaga fans, you need to show that you're the best players by participating in the Fan Challenge series for a chance to win real money prizes. You can see the app for contest details. Download Better Together now from the App Store, and signing up using promo code LOCKEDON will give you a chance to win your share of over $1,000 in cash prizes. Remember the code LOCKEDON, because winning alone is fun, but it's better together. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is also brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience, that's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts to choose from for your ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you are looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags. We're still talking about the Midwest region of the 2024 NCAA Tournament, where the Zags are a 5 seed taking on McNeese State on Thursday at 4:25 p.m. Pacific time. The game will be on TBS, and the next game on TBS. Don't change that dial. Making fun of my co-host Isaac Shade, who used a dial reference. I don't think anybody's had a dial on their TV in over 30 years. Regardless, stick on that TBS channel. The game after Gonzaga McNeese will be Kansas and Samford, the number 4 seeded Jayhawks out of the Big 12, taking on the Bulldogs of Samford. Again, 6:55 p.m. is the listed start time. It'll be on right after that Gonzaga game on Thursday. Let's start with the Jayhawks. 22-10 on the year, 10-8 in the Big 12. That is quite literally the worst record that Kansas has had in the Big 12 in Bill Self's tenure with the Jayhawks. That is a 20-year period of time. Kansas has never had 8 losses in the Big 12 in that time period. A huge testament to the massive amount of success that Bill Self has had at Kansas, considering that the Big 12 is a really good basketball conference. Wasn't as good in the early part of his tenure, but now with teams like Baylor and Texas, and of course Houston this year, and Iowa State and TCU and West Virginia throughout that tenure, what an accomplishment for this team to have continually been at a point where they were never even close to finishing 500 in league play. But that was not the case this year. Started out the year great, 12-1 in the non-conference. That includes wins over Kentucky, Tennessee, and UConn. That is a huge, huge group of victories for Kansas to hold their hat on in that non-conference. Their only loss in the non-conference was to Marquette, who are the 2 seed in the Big Dance. However, 8 losses in conference play, 7 of them coming on the road. This team struggled away from Fog Allen Fieldhouse. 7 of their 8 losses on the road. That includes losses to Central Florida, among the worst teams in the conference. West Virginia, also among the worst teams in the conference. Kansas State, who did not make the NCAA tournament. Kind of a borderline team in terms of getting a bubble spot, also a rivalry game, so not as egregious of a loss for Bill Self's team, but still stands out. They also had a home loss, which is very rare for Bill Self, and that was to BYU. Shout out the Cougars for getting a W there, but that's just not something you see very often from Bill Self's team. They also got blasted. I mean, folks, they got blasted by Cincinnati in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. They lost 72-52 to the Bearcats of Cincinnati. Now, in that game, they were missing both Hunter Dickinson, their starting center, and Kevin McCullar Jr., super senior, power or small forward, kind of guard wing hybrid. Both those guys didn't play. So you think, okay, well, that's a bit, you can kind of forgive them for losing a game like that. Here's the deal, though. McCullar's done. He's out. He's not playing for the rest of the season. That was announced shortly before hitting the record button here on Locked On Zags. No Kevin McCullar for the rest of the NCAA tournament for Kansas. And that is bad, bad news for the Jayhawks because this team does not have depth. They just don't. They haven't had depth all season long. Depth has been an issue for them long before the Kevin McCullar injury. They have 4 great players. One of them is Kevin McCullar, leading the team 18.3 points per game, 6 boards, 4 assists, 1.5 steals. Obviously, Hunter Dickinson, 18 points, 11 boards, 2.5 assists, 1.5 blocks. Your other 2 key starters, KJ Adams, the power forward, 12.5 points, 4.5 boards, 3 assists, and 1.2 steals. And then your starting point guard, DeJuan Harris, 8 points, 6.3 assists, and then 1.5 steals. 4 great players. One of them, Kevin McCullar, will not play for the rest of the tournament. And outside of that, that's the problem. Johnny Furphy stepped up. He was an Australian freshman, actually a target for Gonzaga at a period of time. He stepped up and finally kind of gave Kansas a consistent 5th starting option for this team, finished the season averaging about 9 points and 5 boards. But the depth outside of that, Nick Timberlake, transfer from Towson, expected to be a big-time player for them, averaged under 5 points, shot 28% from 3. Elmarco Jackson, their star freshman in this class, a guy many had as a potential lottery pick in the NBA draft. He finished with 4.2 points, shot less than 40% from the field. Parker Brown, a transfer from Santa Clara, 2 points and 1.5 boards. Just not a good team outside of those key 4 players. And now one of them is already out. This team shot 33% from 3 as a team. poor shooting three-point team, doesn't have the depth. I can understand why this Kansas team did not do what people expected them to do this year. And now they're going to take on a Samford team that, folks, is pretty dangerous. Buckyball is what they call it for Samford, named after Coach Bucky McMillian. They press. They press and they press and they press. They play at a big tempo, force the ball a lot, force a lot of turnovers, get out in transition, put a lot of pressure on. Normally, mid-major teams putting a bunch of pressure on high-major teams or very good teams like Kansas, Gonzaga, etc., can backfire. It might work here because of that lack of depth for Kansas. Kansas has better athletes. They have a lot more size. That's certainly going to give them the advantage here. But this team is good. They started the year out 0-2. They lost to Purdue by a whole bunch of points. They lost to VCU. After that, they rattled off 17 straight W's for Samford. Now, the highest KenPom ranked team they played in that 17-game winning streak was Western Carolina, who was 108th. So not exactly a murderer's row of opponents for Samford, but still very impressive anytime you win 17 games in a row. 29-5 on the year, 15-3 in the Southern Conference. Southern's 13th out of the 33 conferences, just to put into perspective, being the 13th ranked conference for Samford, being in the 28th ranked conference if you're McNeese. The Samford team 81st at KenPom to finish the season. They force 21.6% turnovers. That is 16th in the country. Their field goal percentage on the year, effective field goal percentage, is 7th at KenPom. This is a dangerous team. My co-host Isaac Shade already smashed the button to project Samford over Kansas in the first round. That was before the Kevin McCullar news. Now with that news, you're still filling out your bracket, I'd consider it. I'd really, really consider it. And if Gonzaga ends up playing Samford, we'll talk much more about that matchup. But the Samford team, it's not going to be a gimme either. It's not going to be a gimme for Gonzaga if that ends up being the team that they play. This team is very efficient, very effective, a high press, likes to play at tempo. Definitely some things that could cause problems for the Zags if they can get by Kansas. Obviously, if Kansas does win, Gonzaga would be facing a Kansas team without their starting small forward. Certainly a good sign for Mark Few's team. We're going to close out the show talking about the rest of the Midwest region. If Gonzaga gets themselves back into the Sweet 16, who are they playing? Is it Purdue? Is an 8-9 upset coming? Could Purdue lose to a 16 again? We're going to get to all of that and the bottom half of that region coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Nissan. Folks, this week's March Madness bracket highlight is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest. Just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs, these guys were able to take it to the next level. The Oregon Ducks are this week's Nissan Rogue. The team absolutely surprised us all with a powerful performance in the Pac-12 tournament, punching their ticket to the big dance, potentially saving Dana Altman's job. They say win life, go Rogue. And that's exactly what the Ducks have done here. So take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. All right, folks. Segment 3 here, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we've talked about 4 of the 16 teams in the Midwest region of the 2024 NCAA Tournament. Of course, Gonzaga versus McNeese in that first round game. Kansas, Samford, the 4-13 in that pod as well. All those games taking place in Salt Lake City. But there are a lot of other games and a lot of other teams. And if Gonzaga does advance in that Sweet 16, we're going to talk about who they might be playing, starting with the 1-16 matchup between Purdue and the winner of Montana State and Grambling State. That game will be on Wednesday afternoon. The winner of that team will play Purdue on Friday at 4:25. The Boilermakers, 41% from 3 on the season. That guard room of Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer, much, much improved from where they were last year. It's going to be trendy to pick Purdue to lose early. Might even be some people picking them to lose to Montana State, which frankly, if Montana State wins, beats Purdue, plays Utah State, that's really fun just because Great Osipor, the star power forward for Utah State, as well as Coach Danny Sprinkle, both came from Montana State, would be hilarious and fun to see those two teams match up. But I don't think it's going to happen. I got Purdue advancing here. Phenomenal team this year. I know the storyline. I know what happened last year. But guess what? Virginia, after they lost to a 16 seed, they won the whole dang thing. Hoping that's not the case for Purdue, but it certainly is possible with the way this team played this year. 8 versus 9, Utah State, mentioned them already in Great Osipor, versus 9-seeded TCU. Look, the Aggies were underseeded this year. They should have been higher than an 8 seed. Probably should have been a 7 seed. Argument for a 6 seed. They almost ran the table in the Mountain West this year. San Diego State finished lower than them in the standings. They got a 5 seed. Non-conference strength of schedule plays a factor there, but Utah State beat some good teams in the non-conference as well. Great Osabor, mentioned him already, 18-9 on the year. Taking on a TCU team that was Gonzaga's second-round opponent last year. TCU finished 9-9 in the Big 12, 21-12 overall, but here's the deal. TCU, one of the worst non-conference strength of schedules in all of college basketball. We can get into this another time, but the Big 12 seemed to stack their non-conference schedules. We talked about it on a previous podcast to play pretty poor teams, build up huge margins of victories, help the net ranking. TCU, literally one of the 5 worst strength of schedules in the non-conference. Curious how it impacts them potentially in a game here against Utah State. 6 versus 11 is not 2 teams most people expected to have in the big dance this year. South Carolina out of the SEC taking on 11-seeded Oregon Ducks out of the Pac-12. The Gamecocks were picked to finish dead last in the SEC. Instead, they tied for second. Lamont Paris, AP Coach of the Year for a reason. You turn South Carolina into a strong basketball powerhouse. That is a really good sign that you know your X's and O's. Oregon, meanwhile, sneaks in as a bid thief. They win the Pac-12 tournament. We're not going to be dancing unless they won it all. Dana Altman potentially saves his job here. I think there's a real chance that he was told, hey, you make the NCAA tournament or you're going home. And he did it. We'll see if they got enough juice to potentially pull off an 11-6 upset here over the Gamecocks. Moving on, 3-seeded Creighton Blue Jays versus the Akron Zips, the 14 seed there. Blue Jays got a great core 4, similar to Kansas. 4 great players: Trey Alexander, Stephen Ashworth, Baylor Shireman, and Ryan Kalkbrenner. Those guys are elite. Rest of the team, not doing much. My co-host Isaac Shade likes to call Mason Miller Goose, because Mason Miller is their starting 4, and in many of Creighton's losses towards the end of the season, Mason Miller did not score. This is not a team that has a lot of depth outside of those 4 key players, but those guys are really good, and when this team is on, I think there's a very real chance if Gonzaga can get by Purdue that they end up facing Creighton in the Elite Eight. Fun matchup for Ryan Nembhard, who, of course, transferred from Creighton to Gonzaga after last season. Akron, meanwhile, only in the tournament because of a devastating mistake by a Kent State player. They were playing each other in the championship. Kent State scored. The player thought they were still down, even though they were up 1 in the closing seconds. The Kent State player committed a foul, put Akron on the free throw line. They hit 2 free throws. That ends the game and the season for the Golden Flashes. Really sad to see that for Kent State, but shout out Akron for putting themselves in a position to be here in the NCAA tournament. Then you got your 7-10 here. Texas, the Longhorns, taking on the winner of Virginia and Colorado State. And I say winner, you all know who the winner is because that game is about to tip off in about an hour as I'm recording this here on Tuesday afternoon. Got to record on the baby's schedule, so didn't get the result here for this one. I expect Colorado State to be the winner here. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But here's what I'll say. If Colorado State won, I think they beat Texas. Isaiah Stevens, phenomenal point guard, one of the best in the entire country. Nico Medved is an excellent coach. If Virginia won, feel a little bit better about Texas. Virginia is an interesting team. They have been blown out multiple times this year, really hurt their net ranking. Part of the reason people were very surprised, they even got a bid as a 54th ranked team in the net coming into the tournament. However, Ryan Dunn and Reese Beekman, phenomenal combination of guards for this team. Very, very good defensive squad, as we expect from Tony Bennett's team. Meanwhile, for Texas, I'm not a huge fan. I think they're a little overseeded here. Team's been good when they're healthy. They've had some health issues throughout the year. Dylan DeSue, not always up to par. Caden Shedrick missed some time as well, but I'm not a big Longhorns fan. I think if Colorado State is there and they beat them, that wouldn't shock me at all. If they aren't there and Texas does advance, I don't see them holding much of a chance against the 2-seed Volunteers of Tennessee. That's, of course, assuming Tennessee gets by St. Peter's, which the last time St. Peter's was a 15 seed and they were playing a 2 seed out of the SEC. We all know what happened. The Peacocks pulled off that massive upset over Kentucky 2 years ago, went all the way to the Elite Eight, including a win over Purdue before finally falling to North Carolina. Can St. Peter's do it again and upset this Tennessee team? Tennessee hoping to make their first ever Final Four. Dalton Knecht, transfer from Northern Colorado, the runner-up for the Big Sky Player of the Year last year, the guy he lost to, Steele Venters, spent the entire year on the bench for the Gonzaga Bulldogs, nursing an ACL injury. Knecht, meanwhile, transfers to Tennessee and finishes on the All-American first team alongside Zach Edey and RJ Davis. Phenomenal year for Dalton Knecht. Huge piece for Tennessee. They needed a guy who could go get buckets, create his own shot. They got that guy. This Tennessee team is absolutely rolling. I think if they can get by St. Peter's, which I expect that they will, they advance past Texas or Virginia or Colorado State if it's them. Then it sets up a really fun matchup between Tennessee and Creighton is what I expect to see there. Could be really fun if Gonzaga can advance again past Purdue, be in a position to play one of those two teams to get into the Final Four. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Of course, that's what we do. Right now, the focus will be on McNeese. Check in on Thursday's show. We're going to get into what Gonzaga needs to do to win. We talked about who McNeese is, what they do, what they don't do well, their strength of schedule, all of that. What does Gonzaga need to do to make sure that they're still playing on Saturday? We're going to talk about that. We're also going to get you a preview, get you ready for Gonzaga women's game against UC Irvine on Saturday at the McCarthy Athletic Center. All that coming up. Future episodes of Locked On Zags this week. But for now, want to thank all of you for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Remind you to come join our Discord channel. If you do, you will get an invitation to join our bracket challenge on ESPN. There's a link in the show notes to get on the Discord channel. If you join the bracket challenge and you win, there's some prizes. So definitely join the Discord channel. Again, it is free in the links on audio video. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.